Welcome to Fear and Greed Sunday Feature. I'm Michael Thompson. Fear and Greed has just turned 4 years old. So, to celebrate our birthday, in a rather unusual way, I thought we'd go back into the archives and pull out an interview from our first year. And this one is an absolute cracker. Sean talks to Adele Ferguson, investigative reporter, about her incredible career, one that's seen her win the Gold Walkley, which is, of course, the highest recognition available for journalists in this country, as well as dozens of other awards. Her stories have sparked inquiries, changes to legislation, even a royal commission into the banks. Now, at the time this was recorded, back in December of 2020, Adele was working on newspapers within the Nine stable. She's since moved across to the ABC's investigative unit. And that's pretty much all the context you need for what is an amazing interview from the first year of Fear and Greed. I hope you enjoy it.
Investigative journalism is a noble and glamorous profession. It makes a difference to society and often ends up changing public policy. But behind the glamour, investigative journalism is hard work, very hard work. It involves years of building up networks, hundreds of phone calls, perhaps thousands, reading reams of papers and content, and normally taking on people and companies that don't want to help out. Over the past decade, perhaps the most preeminent investigative journalist has been Adele Ferguson, from the Nine stable of newspapers, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Australian Financial Review. She is one of the few reporters that has triggered a royal commission, in her case, into banking. Adele, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
How did you get into journalism?
I did an economics degree at Adelaide University and was applying for all sorts of jobs. I always wanted to get into journalism, and I was lucky enough to get into the Adelaide Advertiser as a graduate cadet.
Oh, what did you write on originally?
So it was because I had economics. Piers Ackerman said I should go straight into business journalism, which is what I did.
Fantastic. And business journalism at the Adelaide Advertiser, was there much focus on it then?
Not at all. It was a very small, thin paper. There's not very many companies in Adelaide, so I didn't stick around Adelaide too long. I moved to Sydney and got posting to work for the News Limited Group covering finance.
So what newspaper was that with, or was with the group?
So, yeah, it was with the group. So it was all of the News Limited papers except the Australian.
Okay. And then from there?
I went to the Australian.
And that's kind of where you really established your name.
Yes, and then I went to BRW, which was a business magazine that I think you ended up editing after I'd left.
I did.
Yes, and then where did I go then? Then back to the Australian.
Yeah.
And then to the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age.
So Adele and I have worked with and against each other over quite a while, shall we say, and everyone was always chasing Adele. So the editors of the places that I worked always wanted to get Adele on board. And I remember when you went to the Australian, the editor at the time was most upset, but of course cost cutting really hit in. But eventually they actually decided to ignore the cost, and being honest, no journalist gets paid a lot of money, so we're not talking huge sums here. Yeah. But I remember you were one of the few people that management actually said, she's that good, right? We actually need to get her. And that's quite a compliment. So you worked your way through the different rounds, and then you eventually sort of became a columnist and an investigative journalist. How did that evolve?
So I'd been writing a column for a while. I started writing a column when I was at BRW. Bob Gottliebson left to go to the Australian. So, as you know, journalists are moving around all the time. And so I took his spot at BRW and started writing a column every week. And then from there I moved to the Australian and started writing a column once a week. And then, came to the Herald and the Age and was writing a column. So while I was doing the columns, I was still doing bigger pieces, which I'd been doing a lot of when I was at BRW. So I always like to go deeper into companies. And So that continued. So I just really juggled both doing a couple of columns a week and sort of, in the background working on bigger pieces.
Yeah, you are undoubtedly one of the hardest working journalists I've ever seen, because a column is hard, because to add value in a column takes a lot of work.
It does.
But you're always breaking news. And then, of course, you do work with the ABC.
Yes, I do. Yeah, so I started doing that back in 2014 with when I was working on the Commonwealth Bank. And, that was very daunting, because the first TV was Four Corners, which is a 45-minute documentary. So it was a big leap into the unknown, doing A, TV, and B, doing a really in-depth documentary.
So let's get into how you actually do it. How do you come up with your stories?
It's a number of ways. Often it's people contacting me. So in the last few years, it's been whistleblowers that have got in touch. And that really sort of came about after I did the Gina Rinehart book. I wrote a book on the richest woman in Australia. And with the way iron ore prices are going, she's probably heading up to one of the richest women in the world. And it caused a lot of controversy. And she wanted to get my contacts. And so we had to fight it at Fairfax. And so a whistleblower thought, well, if she's not going to give up her contacts, then, maybe we can trust her.
So when you say contacts, it's the people that spoke to you about Gina Rinehart?
Yes, that's right. And because she served me with a subpoena to hand over contacts, documents, everything to do with her son, John Hancock, which would have led to other people. And, of course, we couldn't do that.
I remember that time at Fairfax as it was. Were you scared? And at the time, Gina Rinehart was also talking about taking a stake in Fairfax and joining the board from memory.
Oh, yeah, she did. She actually took a big stake a week before the book was published. And at that time, she refused to sign the Charter of Independence and wanted 3 board seats and wanted the ability to hire and fire journalists. So at that time, I felt like I was walking around with a target on my back. Luckily, that didn't happen and I kept my job.
Stay with me, Adele. We'll be right back. I'm talking to investigative journalist Adele Ferguson. So you've done a number of really big stories. I mean, if we go through the banking one, which you triggered the Royal Commission, tell us a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so that was the financial planning. So the whistleblower was Jeff Morris, who was a financial advisor at Commonwealth Bank, and he'd gone to ASIC to blow the whistle on what was going on with a dodgy financial planner called Don Nguyen. And there was a politician involved, Senator John Williams. And together we really, John was prosecuting it in Parliament, trying to get a Senate inquiry into what had happened at Commonwealth Bank.
And Jeff Morris?
So Jeff Morris, as I said, was the whistleblower who had exposed wrongdoing, and really at the heart of it was the cover-up by management. They didn't want it to get out. And I came along and exposed it. And it did trigger a Senate inquiry initially. And it sort of went on from there. As soon as the story came out, it became bigger than one dodgy financial planner and some corruption in Commonwealth Bank. It sort of led to bigger picture of, it was systemic inside the bank. It wasn't just 1 or 2 bad apples. It was systemic. And if you went across and looked at what was going on in National Australia Bank and Westpac and ANZ. IOOF, the same thing was repeated, that there was a big issue with financial advice and vertical integration, just the conflicts that were involved.
At that time, you must have come under a lot of pressure from the banks and senior people at the banks. How did you handle that?
Yeah, I did get a lot of pressure, and they were threatening to pull out the ads, which when I did the second big bank story on CommInsure, which was CBA's life insurance arm, they actually did pull the ads. It was millions of dollars of ads, which was more pressure because I think they did it around the time that there was a lot of journalists that were let go because of cost cutting due to pressures with what was going on in the media and advertising. So it didn't help. But there is always a lot of pressure brought to bear. But it was great also doing the joint venture with the ABC Four Corners, because it just gave it that momentum to show that there were 2 organisations backing this, because some of the other mainstream media didn't quite believe that these venerable institutions had rampant misconduct going on in some of the divisions.
Yeah, I think your story, a couple of things there. It doesn't happen overnight. So this actually evolved over a couple of years. And as you said, once you did the Four Corners piece, it gave it renewed enthusiasm. And also, because journalism in Australia is so competitive, if you get a great story, your competitors are more likely to shy away from it, at least initially, simply because you got it.
Yes, that often happens. You know, a number of journalists complain, why isn't anybody else following this story? And it can be the case, unfortunately.
Yeah, if you ever want to read a great rollicking tale about that, Banking Bad, that's your book, isn't it, Adele?
Yes, it is.
But what I loved about that book is it just showed how government and John Williams, a whistleblower and Jeff Morris, media and yourself can work together to change how society thinks about a venerable institution. And I really highly recommend that one. If we move on to franchising underpayment, that's another big one of yours.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one was 7-Eleven, which was rampant underpayment. And that again was a guy called Michael Fraser had come to me and said, you really should look at 7-Eleven. There's a lot of underpayments going on. And so just went from there. And then sort of using the business side of my journalism, I wanted to know what the business model was, because in all these things, you try and get behind it and see. So it's not just underpayment of wages, what's driving that, what's the motivator. You know, so I was frantically trying to get hold of a copy of the franchise agreement that these franchisees sign. And it was just so hard to get because the franchisees were doing the wrong thing underpaying workers. So the last person they wanted to help was me. So we finally got one, and you could see that it was really a skewed business model. And 7-Eleven at the top was the franchisor that was pressuring the franchisees, who were then pressuring the workers. So it just shocking business model that they ended up changing. But it turned out that, you know, you looked at Domino's and Retail Food Group and Pizza Hut. They all had different models, but, you know, the underpayment of wages was being driven by various business models that were questionable.
How hard is it to work out who's telling you the truth and who's not?
Yeah, it can be challenging. You have to be so careful because, you know, so many people have vested interests, and you have to try and look behind that and see who you can trust and, you know, what's motivating them. You know, and sometimes they may have impure motivations, but it still doesn't hide the fact that, you know, they've got something important to say.
Yeah, I mean, you are meticulous, and I have worked alongside you at times, and the amount of evidence you would collect before actually writing something I thought was quite astounding. But I suppose you need to do that because you always could think that you could be in court trying to defend your story.
That's exactly right. And so therefore a lot of what you have never gets into the media because, you know, it's too much granular information, but it's really helpful if you need to defend yourself.
We'll be back with more in a minute. My guest this morning is journalist and columnist Adele Ferguson. So we mentioned franchising and underpayment and banking. What other big stories are you particularly proud of?
Well, I was really proud of the retirement villages, which was Aveo was one of the biggest retirement villages, and that was a pretty horrifying story, but it really shone a spotlight on, you know, just how elderly people are treated in retirement villages. So I did that with Four Corners, and again, if you look behind at the business model, you'd find what was motivating it. You know, some of the stories were horrific. So in that case, it was Aveo, the company, it was payday for them if a person left the retirement village. They would then get up to 40% exit fee. So every time someone left, they get an exit fee of 40% on the value of the property. So that worked out to a lot, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there was one woman, Gwyneth Jones, who...
I remember this, Adele. It's horrifying.
Yeah, so Gwyneth Jones, who was put into a psychiatric ward involuntarily to try and say she had dementia and therefore didn't qualify anymore to be in the Aveo home. And as it turned out, it was completely bogus. You know, through freedom of information searches, you see that it was a total setup just to get her out.
That story I remember so well, and maybe it's because I have, you know, aged parent, but, you know, stories of people getting locked out of buildings and wilting in the sun, literally, and things like that.
Oh, yeah. Shocking. Yeah, it was terrible. And, you know, one guy who was left for days, he'd fallen over in the middle of the night and he was left for days, and the only reason he was found was because his cleaner, who he personally hired to come in once a fortnight, found him on the Thursday. So luckily for him, it was, it wasn't the following Thursday that she was due, and found him, and he got rushed off to hospital. And, he had severe injuries because he'd been dehydrated for days.
Aveo, Commonwealth Bank and the banks, 7-Eleven, in the end, they're business stories, but they're really personal stories. They're just a tale of real people, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So the more recent one I did was workers' comp. And again, it was a joint venture with Four Corners, and it looked at Victoria and New South Wales. And, again, it was just horrifying, the business model. And again, it's people, injured workers who are not being looked after, and so many snouts in the trough who are making a lot of money out of, multi-billion-dollar schemes. And there are these injured workers who are just being neglected.
Tell me, what journalist do you admire?
One of my favourite journalists is Kate McClymont.
Oh, God, yeah. Why?
Oh, she's fearless.
She's fearless.
She's absolutely brilliant, and she writes so well, and she's always so passionate, which I think is something that's so important. Kate, her passion for what she does always comes through. Nick McKenzie is a fabulous journalist. Sarah Ferguson, Sally Neighbour, who's at Four Corners, is fantastic. They've got so many good people. Yeah, there are a lot of really great journalists.
I don't know Sally Neighbour, but all of you are very helpful people too. So Kate McClymont, as a younger journalist, Kate would help you every day of the week. Adele, you're exactly the same. Nick's very free with his time. I suppose as you get more senior, that's part of the gig. But do you all hang out together? Do you all just respect each other? How's it work?
No, we don't hang out together, but when I'm in Sydney, I'll catch up with Kate and Marion Wilkinson and Pam Williams and Elizabeth Sexton, and we have dinner, and it's great.
I'll leave you shortly, but what do you think makes a great journalist?
I think a lot of passion and motivation for the job, because, at the end of it, if you can really crack open a story, you can do a lot of good.
You must get a real buzz when it hits the front page or it's on Four Corners and people start responding. The government has to respond or the business has to respond. That must be a buzz.
It is. It's also nerve-wracking because you never know how it's going to go.
Yeah. Have you ever actually been scared, physically scared?
I remember years ago when I was doing Opus Prime and Tricom, and there were sort of underworld figures, which was a bit scary. I remember catching up with someone related to Opus Prime. I'd written a lot of pieces on a liquidator called Stuart Arif, and he was connected to the underworld, and I got some threats, which was a bit unnerving.
Absolutely. Adele, I totally admire you, and keep doing what you're doing, please.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Adele, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
That was Adele Ferguson, investigative journalist and columnist from The Age, Sydney Morning Herald and the AFR, and of course the ABC at times.